In Her Shadow. Book by Mark Edwards. Part 1. Chapter 1. The moment Jessica reached her daughter's classroom door, Mrs. Rose leaned out and said the phrase Jessica dreaded more than any other. "Can I have a word, please?" They were only 6 weeks into the school year, the all-important reception year, and Olivia had turned 4 at the end of August, making her one of the youngest children in the class. For the first few weeks she had clung to her mother every morning, refused to speak to the teachers, cried when she was picked up and generally made Jessica feel like she was evil for leaving her in this place 5 days a week. But then Olivia had suddenly settled down, appeared even to enjoy going to school. It had been such a relief. But the tone of Mrs. Rose's voice, the slightly nervous look in her eye, suggested something had changed. Jessica entered the classroom and waved at Olivia, who was sitting on the carpet with the other kids, wide-eyed and pretty, with all that red hair that she had inherited from Jessica. While she waited for the last few kids to be collected, Jessica looked around at the paintings on the wall, the collage of all the children in the class, Olivia smiling angelically, and the behavior balloons. Green, yellow and red, like traffic lights. Name labels were attached to the balloons, a great cluster on green, none on red and one on yellow, which signified a warning. Olivia's name. What had she done? The classroom assistant, Mr. Cameron, a lanky guy who was around Jessica's age, gave Jessica a sympathetic smile that made her worry even more. "Why don't you take Olivia over to the reading corner?" Mrs. Rose suggested when all the other children were gone, and Mr. Cameron took Olivia's hand and led her to an area filled with beanbags and books. Jessica watched her daughter settle down with Mog on Fox Night, the classroom assistant pointing at the pictures and immediately drawing Olivia into the story. "She loves books," Jessica said as Mrs. Rose took a seat on a tiny chair that made her look like Alice after she'd consumed the eat me cake. Jessica sat down too. Nicola Rose, who was fast approaching retirement, had been a teacher in Beckenham for 40 years, most of that time spent here at Foxgrove Primary. She had taught both Jessica and her sister, Isabel, when they were at infant school back in the 80s. And though Mrs. Rose looked a lot different these days, facing her across the little table threw Jessica back in time to her own childhood. She had been Jessica Brooks then. Jessica and Isabel Brooks, briefly and excruciatingly famous. "We had a little bit of an incident with Olivia today," Mrs. Rose said, pulling Jessica, now Jessica Gardner, back to the present. "What happened?" "I'm afraid Olivia got into a fight with another girl." Jessica thought she must have misheard. "A fight?" Mrs. Rose held up a hand. "Okay, perhaps fight is the wrong word. A quarrel. It was at break time. Olivia was playing on the bikes. Single quote. She nodded in the direction of the playground. Jessica had seen the bikes, actually, trikes, in question. Small and yellow with no pedals, the children scooted them along the ground. "We encourage the children to take turns and Olivia had been on one for a while. This other little girl asked Olivia if she could have a go and Olivia refused. Mr. Cameron was supervising them and when he told Olivia that it was someone else's turn, Olivia got very cross. Right. She kicked the bike over and told the other girl she was a poohead." Jessica just about managed to suppress a laugh. Mrs. Rose, though, wasn't amused. The other little girl was very upset. "I can imagine. But it sounds like pretty normal 4-year-old behavior," Jessica said. "Squabbling over toys. Calling each other silly names. It's not like she punched her and told her to F off." Mrs. Rose pursed her lips. "Sorry. I'll have a word with her," Jessica said, cringing. "Tell her it's unacceptable." Well, the problem is, this is just the latest in a series of incidents." Jessica had been about to haul herself off the tiny chair. Now her attention snapped back to Mrs. Rose. "Really?" Mrs. Rose nodded. "None of them serious. Just little things. Refusing to share. Not doing what she's asked to do first time. Why did nobody speak to me about this? I assumed your husband would." I had a word with him a couple of weeks ago. Oh. Jessica felt her cheeks color. Will hadn't said anything but, rather than admit this, she said, actually, he did mention it. Sorry, I forgot. But, maybe you could remind me. Mrs. Rose gave her a tight smile. Just little things. Not listening or cooperating. Being reluctant to put her coat on at the end of the day. Snatching toys from other children. She has only just turned 4, Jessica pointed out. I know. And I realize children are expected to do a lot these days. I just wanted you to be aware, so we can all work together. Jessica had to stop herself from saying, yes, Mrs. Rose. Instead she said, I'll talk to Olivia and remind her about the importance of sharing and how we shouldn't call each other names. And I'll also remind her that she needs to do as she's told at school. Jessica went to get up, but the teacher cleared her throat. There's one more thing. Oh God, now what? Jessica sat back down. She glanced over at Olivia, who was still happily listening to Mr. Cameron read the Mog book. I'm not sure if I should mention it, Mrs. Rose said. Well, you have to tell me now. The teacher flicked her gaze towards Olivia, just for a second. This morning, I asked Olivia to sit with me to practice her numeracy and she completely ignored me. When I asked her again, she looked me in the eye and said, Izzy doesn't want me to. Jessica stared at her. I asked her if she was playing a game and she gave me this look, as if I was crazy. Then she said, Izzy thinks numeracy is boring. I told her that it isn't boring, that it's a lot of fun. Izzy thinks. Single quote. Mrs. Rose nodded. I'm sure it's nothing. We've had a lot of imaginary friends visit the classroom over the years. But I wondered if Izzy was on her mind for any reason. Jessica thought about it. No. I mean, we talk about Isabel at home. Olivia knows who she is. Was. She swallowed, then a memory came back to her. I think I know what it is. My mom was saying last week how much Olivia reminds her of Isabel. Olivia must have overheard. That must be it, said Mrs. Rose, pushing herself to a standing position. She looked sad and Jessica wondered if she was remembering when Izzy was a little girl. Your mom has said the same thing to me, in fact. Jessica sometimes forgot that Mrs. Rose had known her mom for a long time and that they often chatted at the school gates when mom picked up Olivia. I'll talk to her about her behavior, Jessica said as Olivia ran over to her, avoiding Mrs. Rose's eye and frowning. It was funny, when Olivia pursed her lips like that, she really did look like the aunt she'd never known. If behavior balloons had been around in Izzy's day, she'd have spent a lot of time on yellow. Even red, occasionally, unlike Jessica, who would always have remained on green. But being a handful at primary school hadn't done Izzy any harm, had it? She was the successful sister, the businesswoman, the one mom was most proud of. The star who had burned brightly, but all too briefly. Olivia was silent all the way home, resisting Jessica's efforts to draw her into a conversation. The poor thing was undoubtedly distressed by what had happened at school. But Jessica couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Rose had said. Looking at her daughter in the rear-view mirror, Jessica said, in her gentlest voice, why did you say numeracy was boring, sweetheart? No response. Livy. Olivia shut her eyes and appeared to nod off. Was she faking it? Jessica would have to remember that trick herself next time her own mother started going on about whatever bee was in her bonnet. She decided not to tell Mom about what Olivia had said. She didn't want to put any crazy ideas into her head. For Mom, almost 5 years after Izzy's death, the pain was as acute as ever, while for Jessica what had once been a sharp agony had dimmed to a dull ache, a chronic condition that she had learned to live with. Her thoughts stayed on Mom, remembering a couple of errands she'd promised to run for her, and that led her mind back to the list that lived in her head, the ever-expanding to-do list, all the tedious responsibilities that went along with being a mother, wife and daughter. All the things she had to do for other people, never for herself. Sometimes she fantasized about ripping the list up and replacing it with a single selfish action point: fuck off to Greece. It was raining, and she sighed as the windscreen wipers mocked her dreams, squeaking against the glass. Olivia was genuinely asleep now, head lolling forward. Great, she wouldn't be tired at bedtime. Jessica passed the Crystal Palace training ground and the vast soft play center that Olivia loved. Familiar streets, and not just because she was raising a family here. She had grown up in Beckenham and, apart from her years at Manchester University and a short stint in central London, she had always lived here. When they were teenagers, she and Izzy had sworn that the moment they were old enough they would escape this boring dump. They were going to move to New York and live in an apartment just like the one in Friends. But here she was, back in Beckenham. Jessica turned onto the new build estate where she lived with Will, Olivia and Felix. They'd moved here 4 years ago, almost as soon as the development was finished. At the time, the prospect of living somewhere brand new, a place with no history or damp patches, was highly appealing. Now, though, as she pulled up on the driveway, her internal critic chided her for living somewhere so characterless. It wasn't what she'd dreamed of all those years ago, a house with a perfectly square garden and a purpose-built utility room. She lifted Olivia out of the booster seat and laid her over her shoulder, stroking her soft hair and carrying her inside. The house was silent, just as she'd left it, their 8-year-old golden retriever, Casper, snoozing in his bed in the kitchen. She stood in the hallway and enjoyed it, a moment of peace. Felix was at football practice. Will would collect him after work and, as was traditional for a Thursday, they'd get a takeaway from the chip shop on the way home. Jessica laid her zonked-out daughter on the sofa and went through to the kitchen, where she stopped in front of a framed photograph. Her favorite photograph, even though she didn't look great in it. Her auburn hair was messy and she was carrying a few extra pounds. Isabel looked perfect as always, fresh from the salon with her blonde pixie cut and big eyes, looking a lot like Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby. In the picture, Jessica and Isabel held champagne flutes aloft. Jessica had only just discovered she was pregnant with Olivia and had rushed round to tell her sister. Izzy's husband, Darpak, was there too and he insisted on opening a bottle of bubbly, one last drink before a long period of abstinence. Izzy was beaming and Jessica remembered how relieved she'd been, seeing that smile. For a couple of months before the photo was taken, Izzy had seemed distracted, troubled by something, but she wouldn't talk about it. She wouldn't even admit anything was wrong. But that day she had been serene and happy. Delighted for her little sister. Her old self again. 6 weeks later, she was dead.